In our neighborhood, thank you, Roger, by the way, but in our neighborhood, we have a voluntary homeowners association. So if you live in the neighborhood, it's not required, but they invite you to do that for a couple of reasons. One, because there are some common areas that you can take advantage of. There's a picnic shelter, there's a lake in the neighborhood, actually a couple lakes in the neighborhood, and by folks contributing towards this voluntary association, it makes sure that the grass can get cut and stuff can be taken care of. So anyway, by virtue of participating in that, not only do you have access to those common areas, but also there are occasional periodic meetings that the neighborhood has, and that lets you know what's going on. If the city's running new water or sewer lines or something like that, you hear about that, or just stuff. Anyway, at one of these meetings I had gone to, I had heard that people were having problems with the fact that beavers had gotten into the lake. And of course, once they get into the lake, they're coming out of the lake and they start gnawing trees down in people's yards. And so they were describing this, and they were talking about, what to do and how to get rid of these things. Anyway, so I had heard about that, and I had told Caroline about that. And we've got some neighbors who live around the corner that don't participate in the association, and the husband is from China. I think the wife is from Cambodia, and Caroline talks to the wife occasionally, and I guess it's during the summer when she was out and about, and she had been talking to Caroline, and she was describing that they had been having difficulty. And so in their backyard, which backs up to the lake, they had planted dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of fruit trees. I mean, it looked like a forest in their backyard. I don't know what all they're growing, but they were growing everything. And so they were describing how, and she was telling Caroline that they were concerned because somebody was going into their yard at night, cutting trees down. Because that's what vandals do. I mean, that whole Texas Chainsaw Massacre, cutting trees down. No. Anyway, so she's concerned somebody's cutting trees down, and Caroline said, apparently there's some beavers that have gotten into the lake, and they're having a problem with that. Oh, no, that's not that. Somebody's coming in and chopping our trees down. And I don't know if because of where they're from, they don't have beavers in that part of the world, or she just simply didn't believe it. But for a while they had this, and it brought great joy to my heart every time I saw it. But they got this metal post, like you put attach a handicap sign. So they went to some length to get this sign posted in their yard with this big metal post. No trespassing. I'm going to warn these vandals that are coming in and cutting their trees down at night. And I loved that. That's my favorite sign ever. I loved that sign. And I know this comes as a great surprise to you, but the beavers still gnawed their trees down. Do you know why? I'm not saying they're dumb. I'm not saying they're stupid. I'm not saying they're mean. I'm just saying this. Beavers can't read. So you have this message that is going out. The right message is being communicated, but it is meaningless because, beavers can't read. And so this is being communicated, but, it doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't have any meaning. Hold that thought for a moment, talking about or thinking about meaningful or communication with meaning. We started a series at the beginning of the year that I'm calling the search for meaning. And I want you to realize that our lives are lived in a sea of words. I mean, there are sung words, there are spoken words, there are written words. You see them on your phone, you hear them on your phone, you see them on screens, you see them on billboards. Your car is communicating with you. I mean, we are inundated with words. We are inundated with messages. And people and things are communicating with us all the time. You are inundated with communication. But truth be told, so much of that communication is about as effective or is about as consequential as putting a no trespassing sign up for the beavers that are gnawing the trees down in the backyard. It doesn't really have any meaning. It's not conversation, it's not communication that actually matters. As a follower of Christ, God wants us to experience time here that does count. He wants your life to matter. He wants your body, we talked about that last week, to be used in ways that matter. But He also wants you as a follower of Christ in all the ways that you communicate, whether it's verbal communication, written communication, however it is that you communicate with others. He wants us to do so in ways that actually have meaning, to communicate in ways that matter. So how can I, as a follower of Christ, actually communicate in ways that matter? That's our question this morning, and we see the answer to that question in the little book of James. If you would look with me there in your Bibles today, James chapter 3, we're going to read the first 12 verses where we are told this. It begins with a warning. James says, "Not many should become teachers, my brothers, because you know that we will receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is mature, able also to control the whole body. Now, if we put bits into the mouths of horses so that they will obey us, we direct their whole bodies. Consider ships, though they are very large and driven by fierce winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So too, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how small a fire sets ablaze a large forest. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness, is placed among our members. It stains the whole body, sets the course of life on fire, and is itself on fire by hell. Every kind of animal, bird, reptile, and fish is tamed and has been tamed by humankind, but no one can tame the tongue. It's a restless evil full of deadly poison. With the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, these things should not be this way. Does a spring pour out sweet and bitter water from the same opening? Can a fig tree produce olives? My brothers and sisters, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a saltwater spring yield fresh water." Well, he's got a lot to say here, a lot to say about what we say, about what we communicate. And ultimately, I think what God is using James to communicate, I believe, is the answer to our question, how can you as a follower of Christ, if you have that relationship with Him, we're going to communicate. The world is communicating. They're actively doing so. People posting, saying, singing, doing all kinds of stuff now. But how can we do so in meaningful ways? Ways that actually count, ways that actually matter. Well, how I would answer that is by saying there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. And if we get these things straight in our mind, it will have actual consequence in the ways that we communicate. And the first is this: be aware of the breadth of power your words have. Be aware of the breadth of power that your words have. Now, obviously, this comes to us in the little book of James, and for many, this is one of their favorite books, or maybe their favorite book in the Bible, because it is so wonderfully practical. There's so much in the book of James that you don't have to say, all right, what exactly does this mean and how can I apply it? The application is so direct, and so people like that. It's very attractive. And really what he says here is so applicable to us. It was in the first century, still in the 21st century, very applicable. And so he's talking here, and he is wanting us to be aware that as a follower of Christ, that we talked about this last week, that you are no longer your own. You were bought with a price. How much of you? All of you. How much does God want to affect of you? A little bit of you? A portion of you? A percentage of you? Well, He wants to affect all of you. And He also wants to affect not simply how you use your time and how you use money and what type of decisions and what type of choices that you make, but God also wants to impact you as a follower of Christ because you are His with the manner in which you communicate. He wants you to communicate. He wants to impact the ways in which that you express yourself and what it is that you are conveying to others. And as he says this, he starts by underscoring the weight of what it is, or underscoring the weight of what we are saying to people. And he starts by issuing a warning. And he says, not many should become teachers, my brothers. Now, understand, he's not advising against teaching. He's not saying, hey, you shouldn't wind up to be a teacher because that's a bad gig, because that's irresponsible, because that's demeaning, or because that's anything. Rather, he says, I want you to be on guard about quickly or easily or haphazardly becoming a teacher, not a teacher in the school system, not a teacher in Home Depot teaching arts and crafts to children, but a teacher, in this case specifically, communicating what God has said, about what God has said to others. He says, because you know that we will receive a stricter judgment. So he's saying here that our words are consequential because they can even have an impact on the extent to which we are judged by God. Now, when I stand and when you stand before the Lord, there's all sorts of things that are going to be of consideration. Not simply the fact that I had a relationship with Christ, but what did I do with everything that was entrusted to my care, every responsibility, every opportunity. So not just as a person, but the opportunities and responsibilities as a husband, as a dad, as a pastor, but in this case here, specifically in teaching. It is going to be of concern to God what I have done with opportunities to share with you, to share with others about what God has said, because it can have maybe even eternal consequence. So if I do this wrongly, if you do this wrongly, you could lead someone very much astray. So what you say, in particular what you say about God, it is of great consequence and can impact even on the type of judgment that you experience. But then he continues by giving a whole series of illustrations communicating just how powerful our words are. And he starts by talking about horses. And he says, we put bits into the mouths of horses. I Googled the other day, what's the average weight of a horse? 980 pounds. So it's not counting, I guess, the gigantic Clydesdales or the little ponies, but average weight of a full-size grown horse is 980 pounds. 980 pounds is big. If you weigh 980 pounds, you have eaten a horse. No. 980 pounds is big. And I think horses are beautiful, stately creatures. I've ridden a horse a few times, but I'm kind of nervous around a horse because horses are big. Horses are big. So you have this big animal, but with these big animals, we are able to control them. Well, you put a bridle on them first. That's that leather harness around their face that then is connected to a bit that goes in their mouth. I looked this up as well. Bits typically standard length is 5 inches. So you've got this 5-inch bar of metal that's about a 1/2 inch in diameter and weighs about 12 ounces. So a 12-ounce little piece of metal attached to leather straps that weighs 1/10 of 1% of this animal can control where that animal goes. That's crazy, isn't it? You got this big, huge animal, so much bigger than you are, that candidly, if she wants to, can kind of do whatever they want, unless you're using that little piece of metal, those little straps of leather, and you control where they go. You control what it is they experience. You stop them from doing things. You cause them to do things, all because of that bit, that little small thing that's in their mouth. He's saying, and you see the metaphor there, our mouths are just a small our tongues are just a small portion of our overall makeup, but our tongues very much affect what it is that we experience. He continues by likening our tongues to that of a rudder that's on a boat. And he says, you've got these boats, and of course, when James is writing this, he could not have imagined the cruise ship that Jamie will be on and Kelly will be on this week. Couldn't imagine a battleship or an aircraft carrier. But back then, the biggest boats they had, though, still, they were going to have these sails on them. And compared to how big we are, I mean, that ship could hold literally hundreds and hundreds of people and tons and tons and tons of merchandise. And it goes from here to there because of sails capturing the wind. But not simply because sails are capturing the wind, rather because you've got a pilot, because you've got a captain that is using a comparatively small piece of the boat, this rudder that's down in the water, to direct where that ship goes. Again, this small piece of our overall makeup affects very much and in very meaningful ways what it is that we experience. You know this to be true. You have experienced this time and time again. Think of the ways in which you have positively used your words, and using those words in positive and constructive ways, literally it opened doors that otherwise would have been closed, opportunities that would not have been experienced. More often than not, what we have done is to understand the negative aspect of this. I mean, how many of you had to pick your teeth up off the floor because you said something to your mama that you shouldn't? you said something wrong and that affected what you experienced. You said something that was untrue. There are people that are in jail because they have said something that is untrue. They have perjured themselves and literally are experiencing prison time because of saying something that is untrue. How many have lost jobs, not because necessarily of what they did, rather because of what they said? James is driving home the point that, yes, their words and of our total makeup, not just our tongues, but our ability to communicate, it reflects a very small percentage of who we are in our total makeup. But holy cow, it has a dramatic effect, enormously consequential effect on what it is that you in full experience. The places that you will go, the things that you will experience for good and for bad, so much affected and determined by what is communicated, by what is said. But he continues also, and he likens it in this case to a fire. And he says, consider that you've got these massive forests, huge swaths of land that has been devastated by fire that started just as a spark. Well, we've seen what continues to go on in the Los Angeles area with these massive fires and entire sections of town, millions and billions of dollars worth of property destroyed because something that started off very small, just as a spark. Just a tiny little spark could cause all of that. This says to us about our speech, not only does it have potentially great destructive power, but it has power that you can't control. That you can say something, in fact, this is on the positive and the negative side, but you and I can say things anticipating, well, it's only going to impact this group of people. Only these people will hear it. Only this person will be affected by that, for good or for bad. And so you think, okay, this is all that the impact will be. James says, no, that's not the case. He says, your words, they're like a spark. And once that spark goes out, it could become a massive forest fire. All sorts of destruction. But on the flip side, all sorts of benefit could come because of words that are communicated. So what's he saying? Very simply, what you and I communicate, in whatever form, enormous, enormous, enormous power. The breadth of it extends to massive benefit to massive damage and destruction. Opportunities and doors that are opened, relationships that are destroyed, character that is demolished. The whole breadth of it's enormous, the potential scope of power that our words actually have. But so many times, though, we're not thinking about that. What are you doing? Oh, I'm just talking. And we think of these things to be so inconsequential. Nathan, our oldest, was born in 2005, and since 2005, I have spent a lot of time over the years at parks. In part because we didn't buy playground sets, because I don't know if you've noticed, but playground sets at parks now are really nice. And they're so much nicer than when I was a kid. I remember, sincerely, at my elementary school, there were some like monkey bars, like one thing that you could kind of go across, so like a ladder suspended. And then the other thing, and we love playing on this, old tires that they took off of big construction vehicles that were half buried in the ground. Man, get on those tires. But how many kids today are like, Mom, Dad, can we have some tires? I mean, but like they've got this amazingly cool stuff, and we're spending lots of tax dollars. I don't bemoan this, but like there's parks everywhere, all kinds of really, really cool stuff. And so I never bought any of that stuff ourselves. We just go to the parks. And so I have spent a lot of time over the years with the kids at the park. And some of this stuff is big enough for adults to get on, and like I may chase the kids around somewhat or not. And so anyway, but I'll be doing that. And at some of these parks, you'll see some of the same equipment. Some of it's very complex and complicated and kind of cool. Other stuff is just pretty timeless and basic. For example, a balance beam. Like you'll see a balance beam. But a balance beam at a city or a county park, though, it's not going to be very high off the ground. It's just going to be like right here. and be like surrounded with mulch. And so that way, if a kid falls off of it, they're not getting hurt or anything. And so, as part of me just killing time, I might walk across that balance beam, right? So I'm ready for a DUI checkpoint. Got to practice. Anyway, so, but I walk across that balance beam. I don't know how wide that balance beam is. Let's say it's 4 to 5 inches, something like that. And I am walking across that completely haphazardly. I don't care. I mean, not slow, not fast. I don't really care. I don't really care. But if you, and it's so easy, and I give no thought to it. But if you take that same balance beam, same length, same width, and instead of having it 6 inches off the ground, make it 600 feet off the ground. How do you walk across it then? I don't, but if you put a gun to me and say, you've got to walk across this, I am going to walk across that so carefully. Why? Because the beam hasn't changed. But what I see, though, is that the consequences of what I do with this beam are now enormous. God is using James to say this about our communication. The beam is not 6 inches off the ground. It's 600 feet in the air. Enormous consequences are based on what you say, how it is that you communicate. And if you, as a follower of Jesus, one that God wants to transform the totality of your being and make a difference in the full scope of your life, including how it is that we communicate, if that change is going to happen and you and I communicate in meaningful ways, we have to get settled in our mind. What I say, how I communicate, it actually does matter. Why is that an important thought? Because when you understand how high the stakes are, what do? It affects how you operate with it. When you realize the balance beam is way off the ground, you act more carefully. When you realize how powerful your speech is, I mean, so what you're not on a platform somewhere? So what there aren't people that are buying tickets to hear you speak? So what that you're not producing CDs? So what that you're not writing articles? There are people that you are influencing and having significant impact on their lives for good and for bad. Things that you are experiencing for good or for bad simply because not what you said and done, rather because of what you said. When we get that thought in our mind, it begins to lead us to say, might need to do this a little more carefully, a little bit more precision, a little bit more care. So be aware of the breadth of the power of your words, but also you need to understand this. Be aware of how revealing your words are. Be aware of how revealing your words are. Starting in verse 9, James goes through a series of things that he finds to be illogical. In fact, what James would argue is effectively unthinkable. He says, with the tongue, so with our words, we bless our Lord and Father. And with it, we curse people who are made in God's likeness. Well, just personalize that. So you're here as part of a worship service. You have said things to other people today that are positive and encouraging and upbuilding and Christ-like. You have sang things, expressed things to God. You are good and you have done great things. You have saved me. You have bought me. You have done all of these things. So with this, I have done these amazingly wonderful and positive things. And then on the way home, somebody cuts you off in traffic. You know what you do. Not me. I mean, you. So with our mouths, he says, blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. That doesn't make any sense. And then he offers a series of questions. So does a spring pour out sweet and bitter water from the same opening? So if you have a spring, is it producing regular and diet? No, it's one or the other. And either that water that it produces is sweet and pleasant, or it reeks of sulfur and it tastes horrible. And then he says, can a fig tree produce olives? Caroline, we planted a fig tree back behind our shed the other year, and we'll probably have some figs this summer. I anticipate that we'll have some figs this summer. I do not anticipate going out there at all and saying, holy cow, what are these olives doing on here? Why? Because fig trees produce figs. And a grapevine, you have a grapevine, you're not going to go find figs on it. You find grapes on them. And he says, neither can a saltwater spring yield fresh water. So if you have that lake I mentioned a moment ago, you go to that lake, there are springs that help feed that, and it is a freshwater lake. And so you will find, for example, brim or bass in that lake. You know what you don't find? Sharks. There's not a shark. I promise you, there's not one shark in that lake. If you drag the whole thing, you're not going to find one shark. Why? Because it's fresh water. You only find freshwater fish in fresh water. Freshwater only has fresh water and freshwater fish. Saltwater is only going to have animals, only going to have fish that operate in salt water. He's saying, I don't get this. This doesn't make any sense, how it is that you can have an individual that with their mouth, with their communication, they're going to be saying all these praiseworthy, God-pointing things, and then with that same mouth, they're going to be saying these horrible things. And not just talking about the type of language, but even the content of what is being said and the destructive things that might be said about others that are made in the image of one that you've just praised. He's like, I don't get that. I don't get that. And so he says, if this is the case, so with blessing, cursing, come out of the same mouth, he says that it ought not be this way. Why is he saying it ought not be this way? It's very simple. That what is on the inside, if indeed it is in the inside, should come out through the outside. So, if you are a follower of Christ, if you do have a relationship with Him, that which is inside should produce external effects, including what it is that we say, including how it is that we communicate. Vance Havner said it this way, that what's down in the well is going to come up in the bucket. What he is saying is that your speech says something, and it communicates about what's going on in here. With your words, whether they're written, whether they're spoken, they are conveying not just the message that you're intending to communicate, but they're revealing something else about what's going on inside. The spiritual condition, the connection that you do or you don't have with God. What exactly is that message that is being communicated? Let me explain it this way. Like many of you, I have a part-time job. I've been working now for a few years on the side as a cashier at Walmart. And because there are effectively no cashiers anymore. I mean, it's do-it-yourself now. And so, but sometimes, especially around Christmas time, you'll actually see that they'll have employees working these checkout lines. And it's still faster. If you've got a cashier that can just, and they don't have to put it on the scale, or like they're just faster. And so if you can get checked out by a cashier, it's going to be faster. And so if I've got my choice, that's what I'm going to go for. And sometimes you just got so much stuff, you're like, I've got too much to go do the self-checkout, so I'm going to wait in line. And so likely you've had an experience like this. You've got your buggy full of stuff in there, and you have picked the line that you think is going to be the fastest. Typically, that's going to be the shortest. But something happens. Your line, somebody has something that doesn't have, that they picked up the coat without the barcode on it. And so price check. And so they got to figure out what this is. And I'm like, just give it to them. And so, but it doesn't happen that way. Or the cash register runs out of paper, or it gets locked up. Something happens. And so you now are ruined because you're in this line. Unless you pivot. And has this ever happened? You see this other line over there, and there's oh man, they just got one person in there, and they're finishing it up. And so you get over there, and as you're getting ready to put your stuff on the conveyor belt, the cashier says what? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm already closed. Oh, no, you're not. And when they say that, one of the things that you may have said in response is, oh, I'm sorry, your light was on. And so they will say, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn that off. Now, what you want them to say is, oh, it's my bad, come on, I'll take care of you. But many times what they'll say is, no, I'm sorry, the line is closed. You say, well, the light was on. Oh, I apologize. That was communicating a message that's not actually true. That's saying something that actually is not. God is using James to say that the manner in which we communicate, it is revealing something about what's going on the inside. Whether or not it is that we are followers of Christ, whether or not it is, in fact, that we have been changed by Jesus, whether it is or not that He actually makes a difference in the life of a person. And we are communicating those messages. But sometimes the message that is being communicated is at odds with what the professed status is. Well, I am a follower of Jesus. All these things are true. Well, your words are going to either convey that message and back that message up, or they're going to be at odds with it. James says, God says, listen, it ought not be that way. There needs to be consistency in what you say you possess and how you actually profess. There needs to be alignment between that. When I realize that that should be this way, this is how it ought to be, that the stakes are high for good and for bad. There's all these things that I'm experiencing or not experiencing, or doors that are open, doors that are closed, destruction or benefit and building up and all these things, and it's saying something about whether or not I actually am a follower of Christ. Well, that's going to have a meaningful impact on what you say, how it is that you communicate, and whether or not your words actually are those that are meaningfully communicated. But I've got some bad news for you. You see it in verse 8. On the heels of having said that every kind of animal, bird, reptile, and fish is tamed. Think about that. I mean, not just like with the circus where you had big elephants and lions, tigers, and bears. All that. But, I know SeaWorld has gotten rid of Shamu, but we were training killer whales. Isn't that crazy? So not just simply 980-pound horses, but killer whales. Now, we quit doing that because they are killer whales, and they kept killing trainers. But we've been able to train these things. And it's amazing what we have been able to train and discipline and rein in. He says, well, but we've done all of this, but we can't tame our blessed tongues. That's bad news. Who is that true of? Me. Who is that true of? You. So what's the use? Do we just say, well, that's it? Why in the world does he say that no man can tame the tongue? Because you need help. I need help. And if I am going to meaningfully communicate, if I'm going to have words that actually matter, I need to regularly and consistently say, God, I need your help in what I say, and God, what I don't say today. In fact, maybe even throughout the day, before I go into this meeting, before I pick up this phone, before I text this message, I need you to help me and what it is that I communicate, because I want to use words that matter, that meaningfully and positively matter. The help's available. The question is, will you avail yourself of it? Will you bow your heads with me?